welcome to Give Us This Day. You know, in the Gospels, there's a story about Jesus that's called Jesus Calms the Sea. And this story appears in Matthew chapter 8, Luke chapter 8, and Mark chapter 4. And it's probably a pretty familiar story, so I'm going to summarize it for us. Basically, Jesus has given these parables that are just amazingly and impacted the people that were around him. And then when he's done, he and the disciples get into a boat to cross over to the Sea of Galilee. Well, eventually Jesus kind of falls asleep in the stern of the boat, and shortly after a storm rises up. And it's a pretty severe storm, so much so that the disciples are terrified. So they go down to the stern, they wake Jesus up, and they tell him, "Save us." So Jesus gets up, looks at the storm, calms the seas, quiets the storm, and says these amazing words, "Peace, be still." Of course, afterwards, he looks at his disciples and he says, "Where is your faith?" Now, here's where the story gets a little different in each gospel. In Matthew, the disciples are amazed at what Jesus just did. In Mark, they're terrified at what Jesus just did. And in Luke, they're both terrified and amazed at what they just saw Jesus did. And here's the irony. Jesus did exactly what they wanted him to. He saved them. And then after he does it, they're actually either in awe that he did it or terrified that he did it. In either case, Jesus has the same response. He asks them, "Where is your faith?" Now, you would think he would ask them, "Okay, did you think I couldn't calm the storm?" Or maybe, "Okay, did you really believe that you and I were going to die in this storm?" But he doesn't do that. That's significant because not only did they think they were not going to make it, they thought Jesus was not going to make it. In fact, it says in the book of Mark that when they woke Jesus up, they told him, "Don't you care that we're perishing?" So when Jesus asked them, "Where is your faith?" he wasn't questioning whether they had enough faith for him to be able to calm the storm. He was asking them if they had enough faith to trust him in spite of the storm. They didn't trust that Jesus was going to be okay. Jesus didn't seem to have a problem with it because he was asleep in the stern of the boat. But if Jesus was going to be okay, then they were going to be okay. And no matter what, no matter how it ended, what mattered the most is that they were going to be with Jesus. Pastor Lauren has often said to us, there's a difference between believing God and believing in God. We can believe that God can do anything in any situation, but can we believe in God enough to know that in spite of the situation, he still reigns in our hearts and minds? And more than anything, he can give us the stillness of our soul and the quietness of our spirit to be able to walk through it. I learned this lesson firsthand in a very personal way. Several years ago, my wife Melanie and I were full-time caregivers for my father. He had his health had severely declined, and he needed the care on a round-the-clock basis. And it was becoming very, very taxing physically. And I remember one day, my back was in so much pain, and my body was just so achy, and I could hardly even care for him anymore because I just physically didn't have it. And so I looked up and I said, "Okay, God, I got as far as I can go. You need to take it from here. I'm done." And I remember God speaking to me right then and there. And he said, "Michael, I've been with you the whole time. How did you think you got this far? Everything's going to be okay." And it was at that moment that I knew the three of us were all going to be okay because Jesus was in the boat with us. In that moment, I felt like these disciples who at the end of each one of these accounts, they marveled and they said, "Who is this man?" And I thought to myself, who is this Jesus that is calming the storm in my life? He's God. He's God of all. He's God of everything. Because it's one thing to know that God can do anything, but we've got to remember who he is. He's the Lord of all. And we're his children. We're purposed for amazing things in this life, and maybe some fearful things too. But in the end, what matters is that we're with Jesus. He's the calmer of our soul, and he stills our spirit. Amen.